Story time with Mr. Pete.
How are things? Good? I'm Mr. Beat. Anyway, slavery. Yeah, slavery sucks. This may surprise you, but slavery was legal in all of the 13 original American colonies. Heck, even most founding fathers owned slaves. Here is the story of the institution of slavery in colonial America.
Once upon a time, African nations fought each other, as nations tend to do throughout history. After a victory, an African nation would often enslave many of the enemies it had captured. Most of these enslaved Africans from various nations were then traded or sold to Europeans along the west coast. Next, the slaves were shipped like cargo across the Atlantic Ocean. This journey became known as the Middle Passage, and it became the largest movement of people in history. Conditions on the ships during the Middle Passage were so dreadful that up to 15% of the slaves didn't make it to the end of the journey. Packed like sardines in filthy conditions, most died from malnutrition and disease. In 1619, a Dutch ship brought 20 Africans to the new British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. The slaves were needed to work in the quickly growing tobacco industry there. After that, slavery spread throughout the American colonies. Over the next 200 years, millions more would arrive to work large tobacco, indigo, and rice plantations in what would become the United States. During the colonial era, when states were just British colonies, most slaves worked on tobacco plantations. Household slaves, those who acted as servants to colonists, were the next largest group. Some of the earliest slaves were actually Native Americans, but the natives tended to die from European diseases or escape, so Africans became more preferable. During the first years of slavery in the 1600s, Africans experienced a relatively high level of racial tolerance and flexibility from their European owners. Several slaves could wander freely, get married, buy land and other property, or even buy their own freedom. You heard that right. That means they were actually paid some for their work, and several Africans in the colonies were not slaves. In some cases, slaves were freed if they were able to prove in court they were baptized as a Christian. In one Virginian county in 1668, 29% of all Africans there were free. Some free Africans even owned slaves. Because many Europeans were indentured servants, white and black servants sometimes worked together, received the same punishments, and even plotted escapes together. Beginning in the late 1660s, colonists in Maryland and Virginia passed new laws that further restricted the rights of all blacks, slaves, and free. Most slaves worked in the Chesapeake Bay region, working on huge tobacco plantations, like I said earlier, and large farms. The work there was very hard, and slaves were busy most of the year, working sunrise to sunset. For those working on sugar plantations, which were larger than tobacco plantations, the work was even more difficult. While the most back-breaking work fell to the strongest and the healthiest, less physically demanding jobs were still handled by older or younger slaves. There was no minimum or maximum age for working. Slaves on plantations usually lived in complete family units, and they got Sundays off. Slave families became pretty close, as did each slave community on every plantation. This gave way to a new culture in which customs came not just from their current ways of life, but from memories and traditions brought from Africa. Slaves told folk tales and fables which kept oral traditions strong. They made drums, banjos, and rattles similar to those found in Africa. Enslaved women made baskets using an African coiling method and sewed quilts with African patterns. Many slaves became Christian, almost seamlessly merging their African religions and traditions with Christianity. Their version of Christianity gave way to slave preachers who led congregations on plantations where they often expressed themselves through passionate singing and dancing. It was a powerful spiritual way for them to gain hope. Tragically, plantation slaves were more likely to be sold or transferred than slaves working inside colonist houses. Tight-knit families were split apart, often with little notice. They were also more likely than household slaves to get brutally punished because they were seen as less valuable than household slaves. Household slaves generally ate better, were dressed better, and had more freedom to move about. However, they usually worked 7 days a week and worked even longer hours during the day. Other slaves did things like ironworking, shipbuilding, and working in other early industries. Slaves in the northern and middle colonies generally lived closer to colonists. Blacks and whites lived there side by side, while blacks were more isolated from whites in the southern colonies. By the 1700s, slaves were reproducing at higher numbers, which slave owners of course loved, and they began buying more female slaves to aid this. Plus, slaves were more economically practical than indentured servants, so by this time, slaves had almost completely replaced them. Several southern colonists personally thought slavery was wrong, yet when they realized how much money they were making and saving, they just couldn't help themselves. As more and more slaves came to the colonies, more whites seemed to separate themselves from blacks, which made racism and discrimination worse, obviously. Only about 1 out of every 4 colonists owned at least one slave, but slavery became a very important part of the economy of all the colonies. By 1750, both free blacks and slaves, like all colonists, felt more attachment to America than their old home. After all, the majority of blacks by this time had been born in the colonies. For example, parents began giving their kids biblical names instead of African names. They had decided they wanted to stay, but still yearned for freedom. Unfortunately, after the American Revolution, things would actually get worse before they got better, at least in the South. Partially due to an invention called the cotton gin, it would be over another century before the horrible institution of slavery would finally be abolished. The end.